right. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar. Very excited to have you with us. My name is Matt Valley. I'm a vice president here at Market Vision Research. You may know me as well as being the host of the Rock and Roll Research podcast, if you've heard of that. I'm joined today by my colleague, Benjamin Day Sangalt, for what we hope to be a useful and illuminating chat about artificial intelligence in the market research industry. Now, quick word about Ben. He's a bit of a Renaissance man, I must say. So in addition to being Market Vision's corporate counsel and director of privacy and compliance, he has also had a career as a market researcher before he became our attorney. So he knows all about that side of things. But the interesting thing is he's also been heavily involved in AI since really before it hit the radar for most of us here on this call. And he helps lead our strategy with respect to artificial intelligence. Now, a couple ground rules before we get started. There's a lot of people on this call and we only have an hour. So you are muted and we won't be able to take questions during this call, but we did receive some questions in advance, and I know Ben is going to try to address some of those as we get into the discussion. I should mention as well that you can reach out to either Ben or me on LinkedIn, or if you are a Market Vision client, feel free to reach out to your business developer or your favorite person at Market Vision to follow up, and we're happy to chat that way. Lastly, if you're going to be at the Quirks event in Dallas next week, I'll be there. A few of us will be there, so feel free to grab us. So cool. We're also recording this call, so you can share it with your colleagues who wanted to attend but can't make this time. So we'll make that available following the call. So with that, let's get started. Sound good?
Sounds good. Let's do it.
All right, excellent. So why don't we just start, Ben? I know you're an attorney and market researcher, but why don't you talk a bit about your interest in your experience in artificial intelligence as well?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to turn back the clock now to 2019 when this was sort of a niche domain of nerds and not something that we were talking about in the mainstream. This was not something that was in the news every day. It was very much sort of this development is happening on the side and some people are interested in it, but it's not really there yet. And the reason that I was is that, of course, lawyers are very concerned about civil rights and discrimination. And one of the early uses of AI was in banks, credit scoring, loan determinations. And there was a building concern among lawyers that that was going to have negative effects on sort of society at large. And so we started talking about it back when, tools like GPTs and OpenAI were sort of known to a few, but these were not things that the average person was aware of. And so I've sort of seen this development as it went from the sidelines to being sort of the main thing. In the last year, we've also had a lot of conversations with our clients about this, and they range from sort of, I don't want to say idle curiosity, but just general curiosity. Hey, this is sort of, coming up in more meetings. What are your thoughts? General curiosity to the far end of more of our clients who have, particular security needs, for example, healthcare clients, sort of just saying, we need you to guarantee that you're not using any, no AI. And so that's quite the gamut there. That's quite the spectrum. And I think part of it is that it's so new that there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of enthusiasm, but it is still something extremely technical that is not really in the domain of the market researcher generally. So we're hearing a lot about it, but unless you're personally very invested in the technology, you don't necessarily know the nitty-gritty of what are we really talking about when we're talking about AI.
Yeah. So let's cover that because a lot of what I read about AI, and in particular in market research, it feels like people are talking about different things. So when you're thinking about AI, what are you thinking about? What does that mean to you? And then I guess more importantly, what does that or should that mean for people in market research and insights?
Yeah, that's a good question, and you're onto something where we're really not all talking about the same thing. I'm on a couple of industry committees, and we have these protracted debates over just definitions of where do we draw the line on something being AI. And part of that is the history of this, where these sort of autonomous thinking programs weren't within our technological capabilities not that long ago. And
Right.
so there was this progression from, you know, complex equations to extremely complex equations, right? So machine learning, where it's still following a set of rules that humans have defined, and that if you walk back through that sort of decision tree, you can then say, okay, well, we got this result because the machine followed this path, and now we've been able to explain the result. But we've moved past that, and that's really where I want to focus the AI term
Okay.
on systems that autonomously make decisions that were trained by a human at some point, but which the human is no longer involved in. And by no longer involved in, I mean in terms of reaching the conclusion from whatever input you've put in.
Okay.
Uh, I'll add an additional layer, which is when we're talking about artificial intelligence now, we're usually also talking about systems where the human who trained it is unable to explain how its conclusion was reached, right?
Okay.
So, for example, if you're using ChatGPT and you ask it a question, someone at OpenAI can't explain why it reached that conclusion.
Hmm.
Uh, and so that's when we're talking about AI generally, I think that's what most people are focusing on. We're not really thinking about, Bayesian analyses and things that are more to a lay person's mind, more in the realm of really complicated statistical analysis than
Right.
in this sort of
Computational, right?
right. And we sort of have those two areas of AI where there's the, you know, computational science and then the sort of magic seeming AI, right? Things like Midjourney, where you're coming up with a magnificent image, or now Sora, where you can put in a quick text prompt and get really high quality video as a result. Those are more in the, magic
Right.
category. And that's really what I want to focus on with AI, things that sort of we've exponentially increased our own ability to the point where we no longer really understand it anymore.
Hmm.
And that's where most of the money is going. That's where most of the focus is going. So um, when you're reading about AI in the news, that's usually what you're hearing about.
Yeah. And you mentioned, ChatGPT, of course, that's what we're all familiar with. And, the first message I got from when that really hit, even in the market research industry, boom, it felt apocalyptic, right? There were predictions that we're all going to lose our jobs. And then, some people like, no, there's just some limited applications that can make things more efficient. Where do we fit on that spectrum from your perspective?
Well, there's so many things to say on this front, but I'm going to start with the systems that we're looking at today are very knowledgeable, but they're not very intelligent. So you can't actually trust them to do things human-like, right? You can get assistance with things, but you can't really trust the output. And so the sort of the joke that I've been returning to repeatedly that frankly isn't really a joke is I don't think we're all going to lose our jobs, but maybe this is the way we get to the 4-day work week, right? Maybe this is how everyone gets to, 5 p.m. we're going home. Because what we're looking at now is less sort of a sci-fi world of, advanced artificial intelligence handling tasks wholesale for us. And it's really more of a productivity assistance with things. It's maybe that thing that took me an hour takes a half hour, 40 minutes, right? And when you stack those up over the course of a day or a course of a week, well, now all of a sudden you've saved, 4, 6, 8 hours. But we're not really at the point of, the average person saying, I've automated my entire job, right?
Yeah.
And frankly, I don't know that we're going to reach that point soon because there are so few jobs that are truly technical enough for what we can envision right now, these machines to be taking off of our plate. Um, I think of this as a spectrum from technical to creative, and I'm putting a lot of things in creative, right? I would put
Okay.
market research in creative. And we're hearing about all these technical successes, right? Things like drug discovery, things like, new molecule discovery, which are, on the drug discovery front, mostly it's a really powerful machine that can predict how molecules will interact, right? On the
Mhm.
molecule discovery front, it's really a really powerful machine that can predict the shape of a protein that we didn't know about yet or that didn't exist naturally in the world, right? So
Right.
these are really technical tasks that a human with a less advanced machine or a team of humans with a less advanced machine could theoretically have accomplished in the past. It just would have taken, thousands and thousands of hours rather than a weekend and some money to Google, right?
Yeah.
That's basically what DeepMind did and AlphaFold.
Right. Right.
So but nonetheless, we're talking about these really technical accomplishments. Or just last week, a new a startup that hardly anyone has heard of has sort of become the gold standard of weather prediction. They beat Google's DeepMind. They're far better than any non-AI solution. But at the end of the day, predicting the weather is just inferring something from an existing data set and rolling the probability. So it's still very technical, even though it feels a little squishier.
Right.
But when we look further down that spectrum towards creative tasks, right, it rapidly breaks down, right? No one is winning a Pulitzer with something written by a machine. It's just not quite good enough for that yet.
Sure.
And I think to a certain extent that will change. But part of that is also, systems like Chat GPT were not really created for the purpose of writing the next great American novel, right? They
Right.
weren't really created for the purpose of helping you with these creative tasks. It's a byproduct of all the things that went into that model. That,
Mm.
when you say, hey, ChatGPT, you know, some what's the prevalence of some condition in the United States? It's factoring in information related to your request, but because it's one unified model, it's also factoring in a bunch of other stuff, right? The complete works of Shakespeare, right? The work of Mark Twain, like all of that stuff is in there, and
Right.
it's holding at once. If you want to humanize it, it's holding at once in its mind all of these things and trying to come up with an appropriate response. And we'll get in a little more depth uh, into this later in the webinar, but that's probably not a trajectory that's sustainable and probably not the way this is going to go for the next couple of years. So things are already changing, but the pace is so fast
Mhm.
that, every conversation that I've had up to this point about it has been, well, let's talk again in 2 months because things may be different. Let's talk again in 6 months because things probably will be different. And it doesn't look like that part of it is going to change anytime soon.
Okay. So bringing it to the market research industry, if we take a snapshot of today, what are some of the useful capabilities that you've seen from your perspective? I know there's a lot out there. There are plenty of companies that are addressing this, but what works now?
Yeah, right now, and I'm not going to really get into any specific platforms because I don't want to be saying, this thing is bad, this thing is good. But I'll caveat that by saying, fundamentally, I do think that this is the direction we're heading. This is the technology of the future, and that we need to get on that train. But most of what is there now is promising, but not ready for prime time. The caveat to that, though, is that there are a lot of more niche things that are not going to radically change our lives, but are going to make little tasks easier, right? For example, there are a lot of tools that will help you manage your calendar. There are a lot of tools that can reduce the amount of time you spend on email, right? By saying, Matt goes in and says, I want to write an email to so-and-so with covers these points, and here's the tone I would like it to be in. Boom, email's done. That might have taken you 30 minutes. Now it took you 2. Those sorts of things that let the researcher focus on the research are available now. We're not at a point of being able to say, analyze these transcripts for me, right? And there are companies that can do things like that. But as I said, a lot of promise, not quite yet ready for prime time. These are still extremely experimental technologies. And as researchers, most of the time, we are answering business questions that are going to result in some expense by our clients.
Sure.
And the technology is not at a point today where any significant business decision should be hanging on the word of an artificially intelligent system. You still need human intuition. You still need humans to parse the nuance. A great combination of those two things, though, that I think we're pretty close to is say, well, cheap top line reports for everybody, right? Cheap summaries of interviews moments after they've concluded, that sort of thing, where this isn't your final deliverable, but you can get more touch points throughout the process. You can get a glimpse into what the end result, the sort of shape of the end result, but not the end result itself. And there are going to be cases where that's really helpful. There are going to be cases where it doesn't matter, right? But there are going to be cases where it's really helpful. And I think that's closer than being on the horizon, right? That's around the corner. But things beyond that, it's going to take a little bit of time to sort of see the shape of.
Okay, there's a couple of areas that I'd like to ask you about because I've seen them come up recently. One was somebody I'm connected with on LinkedIn made a post about looking for an AI solution to to address questions that he might pose against all of the data, his data repository from all the studies, all the data that they have available to them. Hey, tell me this about these types of customers. Is that something that's got promise? Is that there? What do you think about that?
Absolutely. And I think one of the early uses, and by that I mean it's not the most complicated thing to do with AI, is internal knowledge sharing, is making sure that knowledge that you've gained from research doesn't just sort of get shelved and forgotten after a couple of years. But at the same time, what you're describing is really just the next generation of, for people who've been around for more than 10 years, might remember, the days of building queryable Microsoft Access databases.
Right.
Yeah. This is the next version of that, where, an Access database was useful, but all the, if you were going to refer to me, it wouldn't necessarily pick up on Ben versus Benjamin, right? You needed to refer to things in an extremely uniform way that is generally not how it's done, right? Generally, you try to have some elegant variation. And so you wouldn't really have been able to do it before. But now a context-sensitive system leveraging AI would be able to say, all right, you said Ben, that includes Benjamin. It probably also includes a bunch of other, Ben abbreviations that I don't use, right? It's going to include Benji and things like that, that it'll find those contextually relevant references that you wouldn't have been able to do with an Access query. So I think that's close. I mean, that may even be possible now, but the needs there are going to be so tailored to the organization itself that I think it will be hard for particularly really large organizations that maybe have, dozens of brands, hundreds of research studies a year, to
Mhm.
not invest in having AI, machine learning engineers and programmers on staff building something for them personally. It's going to be really hard to make that a universal product that everyone, equally benefits from.
Sure.
But I think that that's definitely the sooner rather than the later of what we're looking at development wise.
Okay, cool. And there's something related to that I want to follow up on in a minute. But I also want to ask about synthetic data as a topic that comes up a lot. And curious from your perspective if that's something that fits underneath this AI discussion, and how you're thinking about it in this way.
It definitely fits into this discussion, but I would say in a niche way, but two different niches. The first is, what people who are opposed to it will call fake research, right? Querying non data not sourced from humans to get answers to your business question.
Right.
And that is for the foreseeable future going to be extremely risky. But there's utility in there too, because in the same way that if we were talking about really, quantified data, we could run a Monte Carlo simulation. We could run a million Monte Carlo simulations and average them. That's sort of where I see the initial utility being, right? And that could be used to kick the tires on hypotheses or generate hypotheses, right? That could be the first step before moving on to the research to say, you know, dissolve this sort of pass the sniff test. Are these things that we should probably look more into, or does it seem like this is, not going to land well with anyone? But even that has the caveat of how important is the decision, right? What's hanging on you getting that right? And there are probably some cases where the answer is not that. We need to make a good decision, but we have a good understanding of our customer base, let's say.
Sure.
And so we're confident that it's going to be one of these three things from all the past research we've done. And we just need to narrow those three down to two so that we can then test those two, right? That's a potentially good use case. But the other side of this is that synthetic data is often also referred to training systems on non-real data, right? On data that isn't gathered from the real world, that's created.
Right.
And that I think is very promising because, and I'll move this part of the conversation forward, so many people are concerned about bias
Right.
in AI systems. And these are really tied together because to go back to, I sort of mentioned banking and lending decisions and creditworthiness decisions. That was already a black box to the average individual, right? We have a sense of how credit scoring works, for example, but we don't actually know how it works, right? That's a
Mhm.
secret held by the company that does the scoring.
Sure.
Those companies, however, will readily admit, right? And the big banks will join them in readily admitting that they don't actually make that good of decisions. And the problem there is that if you give someone a loan, you know whether that panned out.
Hmm.
If you denied someone a loan, there's no real way to tell which of those denied loans would have been a good bet,
Right. Right.
right? So you're inherently building your system based on a history of faulty data.
Hmm.
That is potentially where synthetic data could come in to, say, balance out that data to result in a better, fairer decision.
Right.
And I think that even though the banking example is a little more obvious, right? Because we're talking about a yes, no decision. And then in each case, was that correct or incorrect? It's still something that can apply to a lot of areas where, for example, we know that there are issues with medical literacy in this country, with how do you speak to doctors? How do doctors speak to patients? That sort of thing that's all sort of in the background when we're talking to respondents when we're talking to, patients and physicians. And that, my background is healthcare, so that's my first thought, but that applies so broadly to everything where, even let's say you want to talk about cereal. Well, what about respondents who live in a food desert?
Right.
How do you make your decisions account for that? And maybe, right? I'm not an engineer, so I don't exactly know how we would pull this off, right? But theoretically, we could use synthetic data to inject those data sets. If we're training an AI to make some of these decisions, to inject those data sets with more balanced data that result in a better decision. So I think there's a lot of promise there. Do I foresee in the immediate or, at all imminent future, a world where we are saying, let's set aside the panels and go ask this, synthetic set of personas? No, I don't think that's going to be the main way that we do research anytime soon. But I think that there are some really valuable openings for synthetic data,
Okay.
and I'm excited to see where that goes.
Yeah. So it sounds like, and I think we know this, but the adage of garbage in, garbage out applies, pretty intensely to artificial intelligence. And so this is a means for correcting that. Is that right?
Yeah, and especially, when we're talking about the inexplicability of the decisions, you want to know that at least the inputs should have resulted in a really strong decision.
Mhm.
And that isn't true right now. I mean, I'll also add that a lot of the government interest has been in disclosures about bias. How do we regulate AIs to reduce bias? How do
Right.
we make AI decision making more explainable? And so there's a lot of focus on that, but right now there's no infrastructure to actually accomplish that. And that I think that's going to be a big hurdle. That's sort of there's no way around getting past that in the immediate future, where there are a huge amount of decisions that if you can't explain it, you can't really rely on the AI system to make that decision at all.
Right.
Think about hiring decisions, right? If you can't as a human get a reasoned explanation for why it threw out these 6 resumes and kept these 6 resumes,
Yeah.
can't really use it to look at resumes. And that is broadly applicable to so many things of we
Mhm.
need to understand how it works. And it can't just be that an engineer could understand, right? The
Right.
user needs to understand. The person who's actually putting something in and getting something out needs to be able to say, well, I understand how that happened. Not in a technical sense, but in a rational reason sense.
Right. Right. Yeah, it makes sense. One of the interesting things I think for me, in this the whole explosion of AI and questions coming from clients is, yes, a lot of the questions are around, how can I take advantage of this? But sometimes the question is, we need to make sure that you're not using AI because we don't want our data to be uploaded to the corpus of ChatGPT or whatever the case. Can you speak a little bit to that security concern?
Yeah, and I'm actually going to split this into 3 things. I'm going to split this into security, right? Traditional IT, privacy, and then separately legal concerns.
Okay.
On the security front, the important thing to remember is that just because this is exciting new technology, it doesn't mean that any of the old concerns go away, right? All of our existing information security concerns are still in play.
Right.
And there's not that I can see any way around that, right? People are going to be targeting these systems. People are going to be trying to misuse them. People are going to be building their own solely for the purpose of misusing them, right? If we're, uh, thinking very basically, I would say that the era of being able to tell that something is spam or a phishing email just because it's poorly worded is probably coming to an end very soon, right?
Right.
Because
Yeah.
you could just build a system that writes in, the business level of formality a
Right.
businessy email, right? And that puts the average person at risk unless they know, I can no longer rely on lots of grammatical errors pointing me
Right.
to this isn't real, right? I got a phishing email this morning that was there were no grammatical errors. It was just the wrong tone. So I knew it wasn't from the person that it was appearing to be from.
Right.
Um, and so there's going to be a little bit more context sensitivity there in terms of what we're looking for, what people need to be wary of. Um, and and that security component is sort of the most basic of like, this technology isn't getting us around anything. Other than that, there are also going to be a lot of AI-enabled security solutions, right?
Mhm.
Things that help you with penetration testing, things that help you with, deflecting suspicious emails, things that improve on systems we already have. So that's one part of it. The next part of it is privacy. And I can't tell you how many at this stage conversations I've had of, well, you can't put information into ChatGPT because it's going to get absorbed into their model. And if someone asks the precisely correct question, they'll be able to get that information back out. And that's not really how it works. So part of it is there are legitimate privacy concerns, but they're not particularly well understood by just a person who's kind of heard about this in the news or who's dabbled in using ChatGPT, right? And I'm going to keep harping on ChatGPT just because the most people are familiar with it, rather than that I think it represents like a unique threat or something.
Mhm.
Um, and but now that I've said, it's not getting absorbed into the model, right? Which I think intuitively does make sense if you think about it, right? If I make a data set, I don't want random people to be influencing the data set that I worked hard to build and put a lot of engineering hours into making it do a certain thing.
Right. Right.
Random people interacting with that in a way that it is absorbing kind of pollutes the initial effort. So bigger companies, that's not going to hold any appeal. A smaller company that really um, needs a source of data, maybe
Mhm.
it's a different story, right? But focusing on the bigger players, which is mostly what the landscape looks like right now. It's the Googles, the Microsofts, the Amazons that are putting billions of dollars towards this. Um, in the case, they're not going to be interested in that. But there is still a concern there. And using ChatGPT again as the example, they will use user inputs for product development. So when you hear about on social media or even in the news, frankly, at this point, about some loophole or, oh, someone got it to do this, someone got it to break this rule. The way that they're closing those loopholes is by reviewing the user inputs that got around the rules and then figuring out how to fix them.
Okay.
But that means that a person is actually looking at the input, looking at the output,
Yeah. I was
right?
gonna say it sounds very manual.
It sounds very manual, right? And it
Yeah.
also sounds a lot like you just sent someone at OpenAI an email containing the input.
Yeah.
And it's not exactly like that, but it is functionally the same in terms of what has occurred. You've shared information with a third party that you don't really know, and they're using it for some other purpose. And that I would say is more concerning than this is going to be one of 80 billion parameters. It's a living person read this and then did
Mhm.
something with it. And that ties in very closely to the legal concerns, but I want to set those aside because there's another example that I want to get into, which
Okay.
is that people don't necessarily understand the capabilities of an AI system. And I've been thinking a lot recently about, I want to say in the 90s, a researcher who had conducted a bunch of interviews like 10 years before went back and interviewed those people about what was your experience being a respondent? Or do you still have any feelings or thoughts about that? And she found that a lot of these people were sort of traumatized by some of the questions that were asked. People who, said, well, until you asked me those questions, I never knew that, I had contributed to the obesity of my child, right? Or I didn't know that I was an overly permissive parent or what,
Sure.
things that they remained sort of upset about 10 years after the fact. And that is, the old version of a problem that will be bigger now with AI, right? Of
Mhm.
you don't really know what people think they're telling you. You don't know what they're taking away from having told you that, from having had that interaction. And
Right.
so there's a disconnect between what each party thinks they're telling the other. And that becomes much more concerning when a non-human is also looking at the data and coming to its own conclusions. For example, not fairly recently, there was an article about an AI model that showed a person's face and it can tell you their sexual orientation,
Right. I
right?
saw that. Hmm.
Let's say that that is incorporated into your note-taking AI. A person being interviewed about their cereal preferences is not assuming that they're revealing their sexual orientation as part of
Right.
their cereal preferences, right? And you wouldn't reasonably assume that that would be relevant or covered by the discussion or that that would be included in the analytics being done on the back end. But, we're now living in a world where if you're, leveraging these systems to help you, it could say, well, all of your heterosexual cereal buyers prefer this one. You're like, well, I didn't ask them that.
Right.
And that's a very specific example, but
Yeah.
it's just sort of the underlying issue of the systems can analyze things that we don't know they can analyze,
Right.
right? It's going to extrapolate from things that we are not drawing conclusions from, but nonetheless give us the result of that extrapolation, of that analysis.
Hmm.
Uh, And so the disconnect between what respondents think they're telling us, what moderators think they're asking, and what data we end up with to analyze is going to grow. Um, and there will need to be a solution to that. I don't know what it is, but there will need to be one.
Yeah.
Um, and particularly in our industry, that's probably going to drive, to some significant degree, um, where development goes. Um, but there's also a whole legal component to this, which is A, lawyers do not necessarily, um, we're not known for being like the vanguard of technological advancement, right? I mean, I think everyone will remember that the quip of, the Supreme Court saying like, we are not the 9 great experts on the internet. That like the internet is pretty straightforward compared to this.
Yeah.
Um,
I have
and
to say, I used to work for Westlaw, so I
right,
absolutely know what you're saying. That lawyers are
and
not on the vanguard of
right.
technology.
We're not known for it, and it's for a reason. But part of that is, well, how do you contract permitted use for something that you don't wholly understand? Um,
Mhm.
right now, the answer is mostly, well, just prohibit it. Prohibit it now, and we'll figure it out later. There will be, in a year, there will be best practices, and then we'll recontract. Um, but it, it, because AI isn't unique in the sense that the promises and perils of it aren't unique to it, right? They're sort of more general to technology.
Sure.
That there are aspects of existing contracts that are going to be in play here that a general analyst in a large company may not know about. And the best example of this is certainly confidentiality clauses,
Mhm.
where I think that any reasonable person would know if you have ad concepts or information about a product that hasn't been released, um, in healthcare, a TPP, things like that, where sort of you may not think about it in these terms, but the reason it's confidential is that if you revealed it, it could, affect the stock market, things like that, right? It
Right.
would change the fortunes of this company. I think everyone knows that's confidential, right? It's secret information. But all of us, and by us, I mean, market research providers
Mhm.
have by and large all contracted with all of our clients to define confidential information in a different way. And generally speaking, that definition is any information they give us, any information we give them in the context of, executing services, anything we learn in the process of executing services, all of the deliverables and everything in those deliverables. That's pretty expansive,
Yeah.
right? And it takes you from, well, we can't include the TPP if we're running the discussion guide through an AI to help refine it, right? Because the discussion guide is itself confidential information. And that is going to force the development towards not offline, but siloed, right? Something that's on,
Sure.
for example, the Market Vision server that the vendor who built it doesn't have access to. That's going to guide how connected these systems can be. And most likely, I would say, means that we're not looking at a solution that we use broadly for all these things. But
Mhm.
just as now we use dozens of different solutions for different, different needs, all of those solutions will either become AI solutions or be replaced by AI solutions. So there's not going to be one AI to rule them all, but rather every company will be using dozens of AI enabled systems that are potentially entirely living on their own system.
Right. With
Uh,
specialized functions, right?
right.
Yeah.
Right. AI will have its tools, legal will have their tools, procurement will have their tools, insights will have their tools.
Right.
And those may not talk to each other, but they definitely won't be talking to the outside world. And that is a major deviation from what we've seen up to this point, where you're connecting to some system that's in a cloud. You're connecting to, if you connect to ChatGPT, really, you're connecting to Microsoft Azure,
Right.
right? And that will need to change to either you're in a siloed subset of Microsoft Azure, right?
Mhm.
We all use cloud providers now, so that's not that much of a hurdle. Or these are living on your own internal corporate servers and no one else can access them.
Is that
Um,
is that a lower fidelity type of data data lake, if you will, because it's smaller? I mean, will it be able to do the
well,
same things, or how do you think about that?
it's not necessarily lower fidelity. It's not necessarily bad. Um, I do think you're touching on something though that I meant to mention earlier, which is that because this was this sort of like niche nerd interest for so long, a lot of the names of things, a lot of the way things are described, the terminology is intentionally invoking like 70s and 80s sci-fi. And so what we all envision um, is the sort of sci-fi version of the technology, right? And
Right.
most of the time, that vision is really artificial general intelligence, which is not what we have.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and people are. I mean, I realize this is not from the 70s or the 80s, but people are envisioning sort of Jarvis from Iron Man, or they're envisioning HAL from 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Right.
These big systems that run things that are sort of where the discourse about it is like, is it human? Right?
Yeah.
That is what people think about when they think about AI, because we've all been watching those movies for our whole lives.
Yeah.
But that is misleading in terms of the reality today.
Yeah, it's
Um,
it's funny because I just noticed this earlier today when you see an article on AI, half the time it actually has some kind of robot humanoid figure in the discussion of
right.
AI, which kind of reinforces your point. Yeah.
And it's interesting because a lot of the early, and this is a tangent, so cut me off as soon as you can. Um, but a lot of that early sci-fi focused on the dangers, right? A lot of the it, it was dystopian about,
Right.
technology going too far.
Mhm.
But they were also iconic. So, for example, one of the early AI systems was called Golem,
Mhm.
named after a Polish sci-fi story from I think the 70s. And it was not a positive story about
Yeah.
AI. Like, why would you choose to attach these negative connotations? But at the time, it was the average person didn't know. And so it's these sort of callbacks to science fiction that are now, for better or for worse, in the mix.
Mhm.
Um, and it's, I mean, it's unavoidable. It's sort of too late to close that Pandora's box.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. All right. So you mentioned specialization, right? And also that, and we all know it's moving so fast. So specifically to the market research space, as you think about future trajectories, which ones have the most promise or maybe the most likely?
Well, I think this is applicable to us, but it's also applicable more generally. Up to this point, the goal has been bigger models.
Hmm.
Let's have more parameters. Let's have more information in there that can be considered. And I believe, or at least the last version, I think, where they released a parameter number for ChatGPT, it was like 80 billion. So 80 billion data points that are being factored into everything.
Okay.
And that's good, right? But it's also not very efficient, right? It's sort of like, as I said before, you ask me a question about um, the prevalence of something in the United States, and it's also holding in its neural network the complete works of Shakespeare, right? You don't
Right.
need that information. You don't need that
Right.
expertise to answer the question that you've been
Not
asked.
relevant. Yep.
And so we're already starting to see this shift from bigger and bigger models to what's called a mixture of experts, where instead of 80 billion, maybe it's 7 billion, but there are 8 of them tied together by a sort of train conductor AI, right? So you go to it and you say, I have a question about, you know, building a guitar. I want to build a hollow body guitar, right? Are
Yeah.
you going to go to the library and ask the librarian, based on everything you know about everything that's ever been written, how do I make a guitar? Or are you
Right.
going to go to a guy who knows a luthier, who knows an electrical engineer, and who knows a guitarist, right?
Sure.
And those people, their knowledge combined will give you the answer for how to make your hollow body guitar. I don't think anyone is going to say, I'm going to go to the librarian. They're going to go to people with niche specialized expertise. So,
Right.
a great example of this for us is that, you know, some of us are deeply involved in healthcare and pharmaceutical research, some of us are not. So, having a system that can say, um, update you on the current state of research into condition X, and there's a subset of that system that has only read everything on PubMed.
Right.
But then also you can go to it and say, you know, uh, I need to know all the trends in, automotive purchasing or in, um, you know, how the use of warehouses in terms of commercial real estate has changed over the last 15 years. Being able to go to individual systems that only know about that thing
Hmm.
will dramatically increase the efficiency, which is important, but also dramatically increase the accuracy, right? Because in the PubMed example, it's just going to provide information that's been published in peer-reviewed academic journals.
Hmm.
It's not going to factor in that it should respond in a literary fashion and give me a beautiful prose response, right?
Right.
If you ask about in the guitar example, it's not going to factor in how to build a drum set.
Right.
And it's not even going to
Yeah.
factor in how to build a violin, even though they both involve a luthier. So
Right.
the systems becoming more niche also means they become more accurate because you're excluding
Yeah.
sort of distracting information.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. A couple things that calls to mind for me. One is it feels like it's the Delphi method on steroids, right? So you get the 8 oracles together and you sort of ask all their opinions and you aggregate that. It also makes me think a little bit of Nate Silver's 538 model for predicting the outcomes of elections, where it's more around aggregating all of these polls
Right.
that each have their own biases. Am I thinking about that correctly?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. But I mean, I would also add the caveat that as we move in that direction towards less general, more niche, and I think I'll caveat that again by saying everything has a caveat in this conversation, by saying that those general systems are going to remain, right?
Mhm.
But they will become, I think, a little more background, right? For example, we're seeing already Microsoft incorporating Copilot into Excel, into Word, into PowerPoint, into its, the operating system of all of our computers. And so there will be the dividends there of, you don't need to go to business school to be an excellent user of Excel, right? You can just
Right.
say, Excel, how do I make this thing happen? Right. So the general stuff will sort of fade into the background. We'll all be using it. Um, and then we will want to layer on top of that these additional services. And I think that that will push us further along that technical to creative spectrum of now the niche systems can handle more creative tasks, but more specific creative tasks, right? We're
Mhm.
already seeing, if you're a writer, like a novelist, there are systems that can help you. They're not designed to write a book for you, but they're designed to help you break writer's block.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, makes sense.
and it's trained on your own writing. So it
Ah,
knows how you write. And if you're stuck, it can give you a next sentence, right? And then you're back in it and you can go. So those sorts of use cases where it's helping you do the thing that you're good at
yeah.
are unlocked as possible by narrowing the scope of what it does.
Yeah.
Um, and that'll be very interesting to see. I mean, that's a wild card. Anything could happen there. Um, do I think that we're all going to be relying on these systems to execute our daily tasks in 2 years?
Mhm.
Probably the small ones. Do I think that we're going to be um, like fully living in the future, right? Like the sci-fi future of us just sort of sitting back and talking to our computers and it's executing tasks.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, maybe that is possible. Do I think that we're going to show up and supervise the system while it operates independently? No. Um, and I think that it's easy to lose track of the difference between those things because it's hard to find a news article that isn't either this is the most amazing thing that's ever happened, this is going to change all of our lives, and the apocalypse is coming, right? There's very little middle ground of this is going to be really helpful and cool, but we're not, this is not full steam ahead towards everyone losing their jobs, right? There's a middle ground that's more realistic of this is going to be helpful to everyone and it's also cool, which means it's hard to tone down the hope, the excitement, the enthusiasm
Sure.
when it is exciting and it is something that we want to be hopeful about and enthusiastic about, right? So there's sort of a very narrow path that we need to walk. Um, and I think it's been very hard for people to walk that path or even necessarily see it up to this point because there is so much hype.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. This conversation is interesting because I feel like it's been demystified a little bit,
I
AI
hope so.
have this mystique. And that's part of the draw and the interest, like, oh my gosh, this could do everything. But now, I mean, the more we talk about it and break it down, it feels more like just an extension of much of what we already do. So,
Well, and that's something that I do want to point out, which is we're in there are a lot of questions, right? And someone may watch this and say, well, but I've talked to vendors that said that they have this revolutionary AI that's going to change everything.
yeah.
And my response to that is, well, you need to ask them a lot of questions because the technology isn't there yet. And this reminds me of when blockchain was the big conversation,
Right.
and every company was trying to show how they were getting on the bandwagon.
Yep.
But in most cases, it was just, well, we'll apply to this technology to something we already did, right? There are quite a few good use cases right now that exist of um, AI being used to do A/B testing at scale,
Right.
right?
Yep.
And that's very cool.
Mhm.
But it should also ring a bell because that's what Cambridge Analytica was doing in 2016 without AI. So
Yeah.
this is an extension of what our capabilities are now, where we're, you know, if we were not researchers, right, that we would all be thinking this is a force multiplier, right?
Mhm.
This means that Matt can do the work of two people. This means that Ben can do the work of two people.
Right.
And that I think is more of a positive than a negative. There's no, the system can do the work of two Matts. Matt is still
Yep.
necessary in that equation, but we should start thinking of it as a force multiplier, even though that's not something we generally think about in the insights world.
Yeah, no, I like that. That's a nice shortcut that I can think about. We only have like 2 minutes left, maybe even less than that. There was one question that came in before this webinar that I think encompassed a lot, and you might not be able to say too much about it here. Could be a good opportunity for follow-up if anyone wants to reach out on LinkedIn. But the question was from an insights director who explained that she was being tasked to implement AI for some cost efficiencies and potential quality improvements. And that's, part of her mandate this year. So how might you approach that? What could she do now to make it useful?
Well, I would say the sort of the catch 22 about cutting costs is that you also need to have people, and we've talked, this has been a very, not surface level, right? But we've talked for an hour, we could go on for 7 more, right? This could have been all day. We could talk about this all week.
Yeah.
But the reality is, even if we'd spent all week talking about it, things would still change in a couple of weeks, and things would still
Right.
change in a couple
Yeah.
of months. And so what's sort of unavoidable is that organizations will all need, and maybe already all need, um, people who are maybe not 100% of the time, but who are deeply personally interested in this, who are laser focused on it to the extent that when something hits the market, they know about it and they're willing to trial it and know what questions to ask and how to sort of interrogate that vendor to know whether it's an appropriate fit. So there's no way around a significant time investment. But in terms of initial savings, we're looking at, I sort of keep going back to it, but these general utility, Google Gemini, Microsoft Copilot, where it's not something that's going to radically change an aspect of your job, but it's going to have background value to everything you do.
Right.
And the caveat there is that if you are a person in a department doing something very specific, then maybe there is a dramatic something that's going to redefine your day. For example, if you're a graphics person, maybe the combination of OpenAI's Sora with Midjourney with Microsoft Copilot means the time that you go from taking a blank PowerPoint slide to having a fully designed slide with images, with video, with complex design elements, maybe that would have taken several hours, and now you can do multiple of those slides each hour, right? So the more niche your position is, or the more narrowly tailored, to borrow a legal term, your position is, the more you're going to be able to find solutions that have an outsized impact. If you're an insights director, it's more likely that the benefits will be in general things that save you a little bit of time here and there, but aren't radically reshaping your life.
Got it. Cool. All right. we're at time, a couple minutes over. But thank you so much, Ben. If you want to continue this conversation, reach out to us on LinkedIn, find us at the Quirks event next week, or talk to your client director here at Market Vision. Thanks everybody for your time. Really appreciate the conversation, Ben. Thanks for sharing your expertise. And we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Matt.